things on a national level, just to put things in perspective. Flooding in the U.S. has long been a big problem. We have a large portion of our population and industry and infrastructure located in flood-prone areas. On average, on an annual basis, floods cause about 82 deaths and also cost $8 billion in the U.S. And over 75% of disasters that are declared federal disasters are related to floods. And when I speak, I'm speaking in particular to inland floods, not thinking about hurricanes and coastal flood events. So on a local perspective, obviously we're well aware of the damage that was caused by the Father's Day event this past year. And so just to remind you of what happened, I've got a couple of pictures. The one on the right is a shot of damage in Lake Linden. And then also thinking about what happened in terms of the road closures. There were a number of road closures throughout the area after that storm. And as of Friday, I heard that there are now only 4 roads closed. So we've made a significant amount of progress since then, repairing the infrastructure. And here are some more pictures just showing the extensive damage on the left at Coles Creek, at Canal Road, and then on the right in Ripley Falls. And then I'm going to speak a little bit more to the damage that was caused along Huron Creek, which when I say Huron Creek, there are people who don't know what Huron Creek is. So to put it in perspective, Huron Creek is the one that runs essentially by Walmart and then down between all of those fast food restaurants and runs underneath Sharon Ave and ultimately discharges into the portage down by Chutes and Ladders. And so this shows some of the damage that was caused along there. Between the Evergreen Car Wash and Taco Bell, you can see the Taco Bell sign overturned and Burger King in the background. And then on the right, this figure shows the Huron Creek watershed. So thinking about the land surface that when the rain falls is ultimately draining into Huron Creek. And so it starts up above the mall. So we've got the mall here, and then this is Walmart here, and then down here this is Sharon Ave and Econo, and the creek is running through here, and again ultimately going into the portage at Chutes and Ladders. And the red boundary, I don't know if I mentioned that, outlines the entire watershed, so it encompasses quite a large area. Okay, and then this kind of repeats some information that was shown at the previous talk back in November, but this is looking back at the Huron Creek watershed from the overlook in Hancock, looking at the change in land use and land cover over the decades. So the first figure is in 1975, then 1992, and then 2003. And they're taken at somewhat different times of year, but from the same vantage point. And so we can see the significant amount of development that's occurred within the watershed over the past few decades. And one thing I want to point out is also the realignment of the roadway. So if we look at the road in 1975, it's coming downhill and going more to the right. And then it was changed to come down back into downtown Houghton in, I don't know when it was changed, but by 1992, we could see the realignment of the road. And then we see the extensive development in early 2000s with the development of Walmart and everything else within that watershed now. Oops. And so again, going back to the picture of the watershed, and again, this is the Huron Creek watershed. This actually shows the land use, land cover patterns in 2005. A couple of things that I wanted to point out. Again, this is the mall. This is Walmart here. And then these blue shaded regions show wetlands. And when Walmart was constructed and then expanded, a number of wetlands were actually filled in to allow for space for Walmart and its parking lots. And there were some constructed wetlands that were meant to recreate the effects of the natural wetlands, but they're not in the same location, and it turns out that there are fewer wetlands than there were before because of negotiated agreements with Walmart. And then also, the creek was forced to take more of an unnatural sharp curve at this location where, to put it in perspective, this is like Applebee's here, and then over here is the mine shaft. And so it's taking more of a sharp turn than it should at that location, which obviously affects how the water flows through the stream channel. And then thinking about, in general, what happens when we change the land surface. So I had those figures before, pictures before, that showed how significantly the land use and land cover has changed in the area. When we change the land surface, we change how much flow we observe in response to a single storm event. So if you think about the same storm event occurring over the land surface, both before we develop the land and after we develop the land, this illustrates the general response, where the red curve shows the changing flows over time, again in response to a single storm before development, and then the blue curve shows what's happening after development. And what happens is that we get a flashier response, and so we're observing a shorter time to the peak flow in response to the event, and also a higher peak flow magnitude. And another thing I wanted to point out is how when we develop the land, we're altering the land surface and the movement of water in other ways. So if you think about the local area, both Houghton and Hancock, they're on hills, and we've got a series of streets that run straight down the hill. And in response to a storm, those streets then act to funnel the water downward. And so in response to a storm like the Father's Day event, we've now got a significant volume of water being channeled down a roadway, and it's got a significant amount of force within it that's causing a lot of damage. And this is actually, they're both pictures of Agate Street, which experienced a significant amount of damage. On the left, looking down the hill, and on the right, looking up the hill. And so one thing that we do as engineers, which I'm a civil engineer by training, is to think about how we can accommodate those flow events. Okay? And specifically, how can we design urban infrastructure and roadways to account for the movement of water in response to regular flow events and then also more extreme events. And so one thing we have to do is be able to size things like culverts to route water underneath the roadway. These are pictures of Sharon Ave showing the damage that was caused by the flood event, and then also the new culverts that were brought in to replace those that were damaged in response to the Father's Day event. And what I want to speak to a little bit about is how do we decide how big those culverts need to be to accommodate that flow under varying conditions. And so one way that we can do that is to think about the range of flows that we would expect to observe at a given location. And if we have gauged flow data at that location, then we can do so using what's called a flood frequency analysis. And I don't want to go into the details too much about this, but I want to give you an idea of how we think about things. And so what we do is actually analyze what's called the annual maximum flood series, where at a particular location, if we have a gauge in place for, say, 50 years, we're taking only the maximum flow that was observed in a given year. So if it was in place for 50 years, we then have 50 data points that we're working with. And we look at those again to try to decide how big do these structures need to be based on what we anticipate will happen given what we've observed in the past. And so as an example here, I have a gauge flow record from the Tittabawassee River at Midland, Michigan. And this is 110 years in length, which is actually pretty long compared to other gauges throughout the US. So it's a pretty wealthy amount of information. And what we do based on that observed data is estimate the probability that we would observe each magnitude of flow. So each of these 110 data points, we think about how likely it is that we would observe that flow magnitude. And so the figure on the right gives us an idea of how likely each flow magnitude would be to occur in a given year. Where if we think about smaller events towards the bottom of the scale, the vertical axis, those have a higher probability of occurring. And then as the flow events increase in magnitude, they have a smaller probability of occurring in a given year. So the smaller flow events are more common, more likely to occur, flow magnitudes year to year. The more extreme events are less likely to occur year to year. And then what we do is derive a flood distribution. And again, not going into the details, essentially this flood distribution is a smooth curve that's fit to those data points. So again, in the right-hand curve, the open circles represent the observed data. So it's the same data that's shown in the left here, just sorted in order by size or by magnitude. And then the smooth line represents this flood distribution. And what we want to do is use that flood distribution to then infer the size of events that we would anticipate and need to accommodate using our flood control structures, such as our culverts. And so people talk a lot about, for instance, the 100-year event. And the 100-year event is one that, or the flow magnitude that we expect to observe once every 100 years. And it's important to understand that we expect it to occur once every 100 years, but that doesn't mean that in a given 100-year period, we will see it occur. We could observe no occurrences of the 100-year event, or we could observe more than one occurrences of the 100-year event. Okay? Basically, what it means is that there's a 1 in 100 chance in a single year of observing that magnitude of flow. And so if it's a 1 in 100 chance, we're talking about a 1% chance of that flow magnitude occurring in a given year. And so when we look at this figure, that red dashed line corresponds to a 1% chance of occurrence in a given year. And it would correspond to a flow magnitude on the order of 41,000 cubic feet per second at this particular location for the Tittabawassee River. Similarly, if we think about the 10-year event, that's the flow magnitude that we expect to observe once every 10 years, or in a single year, it has a 1 in 10 chance of occurrence, or a 10% chance of occurrence. And so if we look at 10%, then it corresponds roughly to maybe 27,000 cubic feet per second. Okay. Stop me if there are questions. Okay. And so thinking along that line, we talk about what's called a return period. And so if I talk about the 100-year event, that's the flow magnitude that has a 100-year return period, because we expect to see it once every 100 years. And for the 10-year event, that would have a 10-year return period, because we expect to see it once every 10 years. And so this plot on the left actually shows that same data for the Tittabawassee River, but now I've changed the horizontal axis to reflect that return period instead of that chance of occurrence in a given year. Still reflects the same information, just displayed in a different way. And so again, if we think about the 100-year event using our flood distribution fit to the data, again, we're saying that that's roughly 41,000 cubic feet per second at this particular location. And then the 10-year event, again, we're somewhere maybe right here, corresponds to closer to 27,000 cubic feet per second. And we size different structures based on different return periods. So if we're thinking about smaller scale structures, such as most culverts, we tend to think about how big the flow would be in response to the 25-year event or the 50-year event. When we think about floodplain management, and for the National Flood Insurance Program, people talk about the 100-year event. And we're thinking then about the land surface that would be inundated when that 100-year event occurs. And so the figure on the right for, again, this Midland location along the Keweenaw River, we can see the natural stream channel in the blue, and then the red shows the land area that would be inundated when this 100-year event occurs. So this flow magnitude of 41,000 cubic feet per second. Okay. And within the United States, there are certain standard methods that people are meant to follow when they're doing flood frequency analysis, which are documented in what's called Bulletin 17C. I'm not going to go into the details of that document or those procedures. But the key thing is that those procedures, the methods that are used to estimate these flow magnitudes for design, are based on the assumption that those annual maximum flood series are stationary over time. And what that means, again, going back to my example for the Keweenaw River, what I've shown here in the red dashed line is the average flow over time, the average flood flow. If it's stationary, then we're not saying that we have to observe the same value year to year. We expect and do see fluctuations. We have wet years and we have dry years. But in general, they're fluctuating about that same average value, a constant average value. And they tend to be fluctuating with a constant degree of variability. And if this is the case, then we can say that what we've observed in the past, so over the past 100 years in this case, would be indicative of what we'll observe in the future. And so we should be okay if we size our flood control structures and come up with our regulations for floodplain management and floodplain insurance based on what we observed in the past under this assumption of stationarity. The problem is that this isn't really true. Okay? So there are a number of places throughout the US where we actually observe an increasing trend in the data. That average value isn't constant, but rather is increasing over time. And we also observe an increasing degree of variability in the flows over time. And this particular example is for the Red River of the North at Fargo, North Dakota. But there are many other examples that we can see within the United States and elsewhere within the world. And thinking about what factors impact our flood distributions, why are they changing over time? There are a number of possible causes. Thinking in general, the main causes are changes in land use and land cover. So for our particular location, looking at the significant degree of development and urbanization in the area is going to increase the amount of runoff and increase the amount of flows in response to that urban development. Also, if you can imagine creating a dam is going to have a different kind of impact on the water, essentially decreasing the flows over time, perhaps based on how it's managed in response to storm events. And then also changes in agricultural practices will affect the flows that we observe, because changes in agricultural practices are changing the way that the water reacts when it hits the land, and therefore how much runoff we get and how much flows result in the streams. Also, increased precipitation. So there's a lot of evidence now that shows that precipitation is increasing in terms of the magnitude of storms, the intensity of storms, and also the frequency with which storms occur. And as you can imagine, as the amount of rainfall increases, the amount of water that we observe in the streams is going to increase as well. And then also increased temperature. As temperatures rise, then we're going to observe a larger proportion of precipitation events that are in the form of rainfall versus snowfall. And we'll observe differences in stream flows as a result, because when the rain falls, it's more immediately going to run off over the land into the stream channels versus when it snows and it's essentially stored on the land surface, and depending on the temperatures, maybe gradually melting over time. Also, as temperatures rise, the timing of our flow events is changing. So as temperatures rise, those snow melt events are occurring earlier and earlier in the year. And in a number of locations, it's the snow melt, or really rain on snow, that causes the peak flow events. And so all of that is changing our flood distribution, and therefore we need to change how we're thinking about sizing structures for flood control. And I mentioned that these issues are a concern given that there are projections for climate change with increased precipitation, increased temperature, and also a number of projections for land use and land cover change anticipate a higher degree of urbanization with respect to population growth and also in more economically driven society. Okay, now, so that was thinking about things a bit more in general, but I did want to point out what's happening more in the local area to the extent that I can. Okay, so I picked a few gauges, flow gauges that are available in the nearby area. So I've got one that's actually in Ishpeming, one along the Ontario River, and I put these in here because if we look at them, we don't have a lot of data available. This first one is under 22 years, and the second one is a little bit longer, closer to 60 years maybe. But we don't see any kind of trends in the data. One problem though is that there's relatively little data, and with relatively little data, it's harder to figure out if there is a trend or any kind of pattern existent in the data. And then this one is for Trapped Rock River in Lake Linden. And then another problem that we experience when we have relatively little data, for this one is 51 years in length, is that it's hard for us to estimate those larger magnitudes of flows. And so I said that the 100-year event is the one that's used for floodplain management, flood insurance, that kind of thing. If we only have, say, 50 years of data, we can't reliably estimate the size of the 100-year event. The largest return period that we can think about is truly 50 years with our 50 years of data, and even then, it's still not going to be that great because we're at the limits of our set of data. And so this shows for that Trapped Rock River, that same idea I was talking about before, where we've got our observed data, we're fitting a flood distribution to that observed data. So again, kind of like a smooth curve representing the general trend of the data, general distribution. And if we think about the 50-year return period, you can see how that curve doesn't really line up with the observed data. So you can imagine how much uncertainty is going to be in estimating that magnitude of flow. And then if we want the 100-year event, then we're really just extrapolating beyond what we've observed, coming up with our best guess of what that magnitude of flow would be based on the data available. And so again, you can imagine how uncertain that estimate could be. When we have limited data at a location, so for instance, most of our locations in the UP, or even no data, gauged flow data available to us, then we do have other methods that we can use to estimate the magnitude of flow associated with a given return period. One thing that we could do is develop a physical model for a given watershed, where we're really thinking about modeling each aspect of the hydrologic cycle. And that model could then be driven by the precipitation. But in order to develop that model, we have to have a large amount of data in order to properly characterize how the water is going to move through the system. And so even then, it's very time intensive and the data requirements are high. And if we don't have that, then there's nothing to say that our model is truly reliable in estimating those larger return period flows. However, this type of model can be useful when we want to think about impacts related to perhaps, say, developing a certain area of a watershed, trying to think about what's happening now versus what would happen if we alter the watershed. And then also thinking about what would happen in response to increasing amounts of precipitation, for instance, as is anticipated in response to climate change. And so thinking about those ideas, thinking about how we could think about how flows will change, and again, getting back to the basic idea of this talk, which was to think about precipitation in particular, I've got a couple of figures that show how precipitation has been observed to be changing over time, and then I'll speak a little bit to what is anticipated to happen in the future. And so this is for the US as a whole, looking at trends in heavy precipitation. So we're looking at already those extreme precipitation events and how often they occur over the decades. So starting in the 1900s, we see that there were a few more extreme events. Things declined in the early 1900s. We've got this upward trend moving to the present day. So we're definitely seeing an increasing trend in heavy precipitation events, those larger rainfall events. And this shows where in the United States we're observing the greatest degree of changes, or the largest number of increases in the frequency of those heavy storm events. And so where you want to be is in this beige yellow color. Where we are is in the dark blue color. So it turns out that where the effects have been observed to be the greatest, where these heavy storms are becoming more frequent, is in the Northeast and the Midwest. Right? So that includes us. And these trends are expected to continue. And one thing to observe is that, so it's not shown here, but those heavy storms, again, they're becoming more frequent, but also the intensity of those storms is increasing. So the amount of rain that's observed when these storms occur is larger than it used to be in the past. Okay, so they're more frequent, more intense, higher magnitude storms. Okay, so again, the question of this talk was, is the Father's Day event the new normal? Right, so again, bringing it back to the local area, this actually shows annual precipitation, so just thinking about the total amount that we observe in a given year. And this starts in 1892 and goes to 2017. And what we see is that the total precipitation per year had been higher in the past. We saw it decline in recent decades, but now if you look to the far right of the figure, we see it uptrending again, right? So we see this rise in annual precipitation.
But that's all, isn't it, in different locations too?
Yeah.
And this should be expected, this increase in precipitation, because we're observing increases in temperature. And this is on a global scale, so globally looking at how temperature is changing from about 1850 up to early 2000s. And if you look at the points, those are showing what the actual data is. The general trend, though, over that entire period is shown by the red line, and then over shorter periods, we got the trend as well. And the issue with this is that as air temperature increases, the warmer the temperature is, the more water vapor that the air can hold. And if there's more water vapor in the air, then there's a higher potential for more storm events and also for more extreme storm events. Okay, so they go hand in hand, thinking about the precipitation and the air temperature. And again, this is on a global perspective. So trying to zoom in on what's happening locally. Not that this is local, but this shows the observed change in surface temperature, where it's looking at the change in 1986 to 2016, relevant to what happened earlier in the 19th century, so 1901 or 1901 to 1960. And in general, the temperature has increased by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit over the continental US. And if you look at where we are up there in the Great Lakes region, we're about a 1.8 increase over that period of time. And then I said I would speak to what's anticipated in the future. So thinking a little bit about projected changes in temperature. And again, not going into the details, just trying to give you the general idea. These figures look at different regions within the United States, looking at how that annual average temperature is expected to change. Overall, it's expected to rise by another 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the entire United States. If we're looking at the future period being 2021 to 2050, relative to what was observed in 1976 to 2005. Okay, so not too far in the future relative to not too far in the past. But again, thinking about things more locally, so this is zooming in more on our region. So we're in the upper portion of that green rectangle that encompasses the region addressed here. And this is again looking at what's happening for the future period relative to what's been observed, where this shows relative changes in temperature. First, that black line is showing the relative change in temperature for the period 1906 to 2005 relative to what was observed 1901 to 1950. And then looking into the future, starting at 2001 going to 2100, that orange envelope indicates the range of possible temperatures that we could observe in the future. And that orange envelope would be under a business as usual scenario. So if we make no changes to the way that we are doing things now, this is what we can anticipate, or the range of possibilities that we can anticipate in the future. At the far right of the figure, those lines indicate what's going to happen at that far future period, 2100, where the middle curve, or the middle line, the orange line, again represents the range of possible temperatures that we could observe, again under that business as usual scenario if we don't make any changes. The red curve, or line, shows what we can anticipate if we are assuming a more economically driven scenario. So if we want to change things to be economically driven society, then we're going to observe a higher increase in temperature. The blue line represents what we would anticipate if we had a more environmentally conscious scenario. So if we make changes, recognizing that the temperature is going to increase, but trying to lessen our impact, overall, we still see that we're going to observe an increase in temperature, but it's perhaps not as bad as what would be observed if we don't make any changes. Okay. And this shows in a little more detail what's happening at different points in time under different scenarios. And the main idea here is that the top two panels correspond to 2050. The bottom two panels correspond to 2100. On the left, those correspond to a more environmentally conscious scenario. On the right, those would be more economically driven. And in all cases, if you look at the Great Lakes region, we're observing positive changes in temperature over time, obviously being much worse in the case where we're looking at a more economically driven society further out into the future.
Huh? Why do you think the intensity is increasing further north? The further north on here.
That's a good question. I do not have an answer. I apologize. Okay. This shows similar information where on the left, this is again on an annual time scale, and then the two other panels are showing what's happening on a seasonal time scale. So the middle corresponds to the months of December, January, and February, and the far right would be June, July, and August, so more winter versus summer. And this is looking at relative changes in temperature between 1980 and 1999, compared to, again, that far future period, 2080 to 2099. And again, we're seeing changes in temperature with increases in temperature, especially for our particular region. And so if we think about this in terms of what I was talking about before, for the December, January, February months, we're looking at potentially an increase in temperature on the order of 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. And so we can anticipate, again, a higher proportion of precipitation events in the form of rainfall versus snow. And again, earlier snow melt events altering that flood distribution that we're using to size flood control infrastructure.
Geographically, I don't get what we were looking at.
Let's see. So, United States, right here. This is the Great Lakes. I can see it because I've looked at it so many times. Other questions or points of clarification? Okay. So this is the same kind of thing. Here you can actually see the outline of the continent a bit better, right? So you can see the United States, see Canada, see Mexico. And this is same basic idea, but in terms of precipitation. So we've got projected changes in precipitation on an annual basis on the left, thinking about the winter months in the middle, summer months on the right. And in general, again, if you focus on the Great Lakes region, so here, we're looking at on annual, maybe a 5 to 10% increase in precipitation. also similarly for the winter months, and then perhaps it's decreasing in the summer months.
Going back a few slides,
Uh-huh.
when you had, we're showing the average precipitation or the average rain.
Yeah.
In the chart, you had a 30-year period where it went below average.
Oh, for Houghton County.
Yeah.
That was
How do you-
average annual. And so one thing that I don't have here is showing what's happening in terms of the individual storm events in Houghton County. And so it's not necessarily the average annual depth that we need to be focused on, or depth of rainfall that we need to focus on, but how the depth or magnitude of an individual storm event is changing. Right, so we could have drier months in the summer, wetter months in the winter, as this tends to suggest we would observe. And in those wetter months in the winter, we could be observing greater amounts of rainfall for an individual storm, but averaging that with the summer months, perhaps it's not really rising on average over the year. And it's those individual storm events that are going to lead to things like the Father's Day event, not what's happening on average over the year.
Okay. You're making projections based on the increase though.
Yes.
So you had a 30-year period of time where you fell below normal.
Mhm.
Who's to say that the year after the one at the end of the chart, which is high, it's not going to drop below normal for the next 30 years?
It could. They're all projections based on models. So it's a best guess of what the future could be based on the way that the atmospheric patterns circulate, which is what my next slide was getting at, and then a number of other factors. There's question.
As precipitation increases, temperature increases, it looks like it's going towards the east.
There's some skepticism downstairs, you think?
Yes.
Is it increasing at the same rate in the west? Or is it fast
In terms of the
temperature?
temperature, I would say it's about the same overall on average. If you look at this figure, right, it's pretty evenly distributed across most of the United States, except along the coastal regions where the dynamics of things are much different anyhow. Yes, because the air circulation patterns move west.
It's changing the same rate all the way around.
Not necessarily, because they don't just move west to east. There is a fluctuation north to south as well. It might depend on the time of year. Yep.
Can you repeat the questions for people upstairs?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Oh, yeah. So the question was, what was the source of this? And it's from the IPCC reports. So these are from the IPCC 4 reports. Some of them that I showed were the more recent report.
How far back can we go to get a look at a human compilation of rainfall, whether in the United States or globally? How far back can we deem it to be accurate?
The question was, how far back can we look at things globally in terms of precipitation?
Correct. Accumulate where humans have compiled.
Where humans have observed.
Right.
So thinking about
Information.
gauged precipitation data. That's going to depend on the area, right? So in the United States, we have more data than in other places, like developing countries have less data available. And even throughout the United States, there are locations where we have relatively little data and locations where we have more data.
How about in Europe, in 1400, 1200?
If they were gathering data, but I don't look at Europe in terms of data. I'm doing my research in the US, so I don't have the expertise to speak to that. Okay.
But we're speaking globally here. Now, globally is the whole thing all the way
Some
around.
is global, some is local. Okay, so I think this is almost my last slide. So one thing that this came up in response to some other questions. So thinking about these climate patterns and how those climate patterns are influencing changes in precipitation and changes in storm events. And so if we think about the jet stream, this is another factor that's influencing the intensity and frequency of those storms, because the speed of that jet stream and how wavy that jet stream is, so how far south and north it reaches, is changing. So the jet stream is, in general, moving those storm patterns west to east, but it's not just moving west to east, right? So I said that before, where we've also got this sinuous motion going north to west. It is changing. So it turns out that that sinuosity is increasing, and the rate at which the jet stream moves is decreasing. And it's changing because the jet stream responds to differences in temperature between the Arctic and then the mid-latitude. And as the air temperatures are rising, it's changing how that jet stream moves, and therefore how the storm patterns move. And one thing that's happening in response to that is that we are observing storms that are essentially stalling over certain locations. And so if you think about in the local area, what we would typically observe for more intense storms, larger thunderstorms, they could be very intense. We could see a lot of rain, but they would move through pretty quickly. Versus the Father's Day event that really just stopped over us for a long period of time, dropping the water on us. The same kind of thing happened in California last spring. If you're familiar with the Oroville Dam that was in the news. So that was a storm system that was stalling over that area. Also thinking about Hurricane Harvey last fall and what was observed in Houston. And then again, Hurricane Florence this fall over the Carolinas. Okay, so all of those storm patterns, storm systems are moving slower and again, essentially stalling over locations, resulting in much more extreme amounts of rainfall, these heavier downpour events. I won't comment. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to say, I have essentially a takeaway message. So these are the things that perhaps you would think about after leaving here today. So I wanted to say that climate is changing. We do anticipate more intense storms, and we already are observing more intense storms. Also, we've got this stalling of the storm systems due to rising temperatures. There's a shift towards a higher proportion of rainfall versus snow in a number of different locations, and earlier snow melt events in a number of locations. And so what I wanted to say is that as we continue to urbanize our community, we need to consider the potential increase in runoff due to climate change in response to those aspects above. The increase in runoff when we modify our watersheds, so change the land surface, and also understand how we alter runoff patterns when we're putting in roadways and doing other things like that. And then the last thing is where we choose to build and how we choose to build impacts our resilience to the increasing risk of heavy storm events and flood events.